just want to differentiate performance. When we talk about technical performance, we're talking about the technical aspects of one's work. So with your clients, it's how well they write the software, or how well they conduct the surgery, or whatever their work is, the technical aspects. So, leadership's really familiar with managing performance, but they are not so focused on managing conduct, which is here defined as interpersonal behavior with coworkers, clients, customers, patients, in the case of academics, students, etc. So I just like to make that differentiation of performance versus conduct. So an abrasive leader, as I said, anybody who's interpersonal behavior, and we're talking about people who have a chronic pattern of abrasive behavior. I mean, we all have our moments, and we can all behave in ways that cause emotional distress in other people. But we're looking at a chronic pattern here, and it can be directed at their direct reports, their subordinates, peers, or superiors, and sometimes all three. That's, and also they don't see themselves as abrasive. When you talk with them, or you bring forward, or the employer brings forward concerns saying, we're getting a lot of complaints about you, they don't see themselves as abrasive. They think that their style, which is very aggressive, is sort of noble and necessary. So what do we mean by abrasive behaviors? And I can't have you raise your hands right now because, a lot of you have your cameras turned off. But here we're coming up with a list: shouting, swearing, storming out of meetings, name calling, ignoring or shunning, intimidation, such as glaring or snorting, over control, hostile, sarcastic humor. How about public humiliation? Humiliating coworkers in front of others, or maligning another's character or reputation. Inappropriate sexual comments or behavior, making threats, throwing objects, or hitting objects, slamming tables, or in the worst case scenario, hitting people. So this does not encompass every single abrasive behavior, but that gives you a flavor for it. Now, people say, well, is this conflict? Are we talking about conflict, and do we want to use conflict management tools? And I want to differentiate, because conflict can be a dispute over a given issue, and if it's addressed in a civil manner, then it's healthy conflict. We disagree. I think we should do A, you think we should do B. That's conflict. But if the conflict occurs because of a chronically abrasive management style, then the conflict is just a symptom of this underlying abrasive style. So you'll see a lot of, people say, oh, so-and-so has, personality conflicts. Well, when there are multiple personality conflicts and one person is the common denominator, I would predict we're looking at an abrasive individual, abrasive leader. And so, do coworkers perceive that the interpersonal interactions are disrespectful? Probably looking at abrasion. And like I said before, does the conflict occur with more than one person? We're looking at a pattern. And is there a continuing pattern of coworker distress related to disrespectful leadership behavior? So is the employer or leadership getting multiple complaints about this individual? When I looked at my cases and kind of did a meta-analysis, the top 5 behaviors that I observed in the clients that were referred to me is, one, these are individuals who tend to overreact. They don't slow down and think deeply and try and work through issues. They're very reactive. They may be over-controlling, domineering. They may make threats to their coworkers of, if you can't do it, I can get someone who can, or whatever. Public humiliation was a very common theme, and also condescension, having a very superior, dismissive attitude. He or she doesn't listen to us, doesn't care about what we have to say. He or she thinks they know it all and dismisses our views. So these are sort of the general themes. And the symptoms of chronic abrasion, how do you know it's occurring in the workplace, is you'll have continuing informal or formal complaints. And I'm going to start calling these negative perceptions. Because this is very important in the coaching process. So there are a lot of complaints brought by employees about this individual. And as far as abrasive leaders, you'll see people trying to transfer out of the department or avoid being transferred in. Increased attrition, sick leave, and when new employees show up, they'll be told things like, well, watch out for him, don't get in his way, or don't get on her bad side, you'll pay if you do. You're sort of warned. There can be a lot of leadership time devoted to addressing the resulting distress. A lot of discussions, what should we do? Perhaps we should talk to the leader, but there's a lot of time devoted to this. And unfortunately, if leadership does not deal with the abrasive, I'm going to use the term abrasive leader, although these principles can apply to any employee. But as you know, most organizations will invest in their leaders, whereas they may not invest in their lower level employees, like the mailroom clerk or something. So, I think I have always ended up working more with leaders, and abrasive leaders have a much greater impact. But what happens is, if leadership doesn't do something about this abrasive boss or leader, then the employees can interpret this as weakness. They can say, oh, they're too afraid to deal with him or her, or worse, that leadership is tacitly condoning the behaviors. So part of the coaching process is interviewing coworkers. And I've heard so many coworkers say, well, I don't think they ever did anything about this person because they were comfortable with how he or she treated employees. They condoned it. I'm not going to throw a lot of statistics at you today, but I think particularly if you are in this, using this coaching process, this is a pretty powerful study that was conducted at University of North Carolina about the costs of abrasive behavior, where 775 business people described abrasive interactions in which they were the target of rudeness, insensitivity, or disrespect. And they were asked, how did you respond having an abrasive leader? 48% intentionally decreased their work effort. 47% intentionally decreased their time at work. Why should I go to work and work so hard when I'm being treated this way? 38% decreased the quality of their work. 63% lost work time avoiding the offender. And 66 said their performance declined, and 78% said their commitment to the organization declined. So even though it might be one leader who's abrasive, it has a wider impact. So I think those are some pretty powerful numbers. And finally, 12% left their job because of the abrasive behavior. Now, let's get into this question of what causes abrasive behavior. But before I go into that, I'd like to just kind of share, how did I get involved with all of this? Well, back in 1980s, I moved to Alaska. I bought a ticket on the ferry and I moved up there, and I was a social worker therapist, and I wanted to see the frontier. And I ended up living in Anchorage, and I ended up working for the very first Employee Assistance Program, or EAP, in Alaska. And for those of you who might not know what an EAP is, it's a private counseling service where companies can purchase counseling for their employees who are having personal problems. And the company doesn't know who shows up, or it's very confidential. And so when I started working there, I was looking forward to helping these employees deal with their personal problems, whether it was marital problems or family issues or addiction or whatever. But what surprised me was the number of people who came in talking about their suffering at work, not at home, but at work. And I'll never forget, one day we had somebody who called up and said they needed an emergency appointment. And I was the only counselor there. And could I see this person? And absolutely I could. And so, we sat down in my office, and it was somebody who worked for an oil company up on the North Slope of Alaska, up in the Arctic. And I said, how can I help you? And he said, I'm really angry at my boss. I'm really mad at my boss. And I said, well, what's going on? Tell me more. And he said, well, he calls me names. He shouts at me. He humiliates me in front of other people. He gives me terrible shifts. He's always making fun of me. And I even went and told, human resources about it, and they haven't done anything, and I'm really angry with him. And I said, well, what do you mean you're really angry with him? And he said, I'm thinking of killing him. And as a therapist, you're supposed to say, do you have a plan for that? And he said, my gun's out in my truck. And I was, newly minted as a counselor, and I trotted down the hall. I said, excuse me for a moment. And I went down the hallway to my boss, who was kind of a seasoned Alaskan. And I said, this guy is saying that he wants to kill his boss because of how he's being treated. What should we do? And my boss said, ask him if he'll give us the gun. So I went down back to my office and I said, would you be willing to give us the gun? And he said, yes. And he looked so relieved that he had come in and was not going to end up killing his boss. So we actually put that gun in the safe. The sad story is that wasn't the first gun that we put in that safe. And so I knew nothing about, I'd never heard the term workplace bullying, or, I was new to this concept of suffering at work. And so that was the beginning of my interest of two questions. Why would a boss treat their employee that way? Why would a boss do that to their employee? And secondly, why didn't the company do anything when he went and, complained when he said he was being treated so badly? So I didn't get a chance to really study those questions and explore them until about 10 years later, when I started my own very small private practice, kind of doing this workplace consulting. And I got a reputation for working with difficult people or difficult leaders. And again, this was back 1990. I had never, they weren't even calling people coaches back then. And I had never read anything. I had no idea what workplace bullying is, anything. But I started getting these clients, and since I knew nothing, I just got curious. I just said, I got really curious. And as I said, they were my greatest teachers. And I'm going to share some of the insights that I've learned that have really stood up over time about this behavior. Why would bosses do this? So what causes abrasive leadership behavior? And there are really three theories. One is that these people are mentally disordered. All right, they're psychopaths, bosses from hell. They're crazy. They're crazy and they have a mental disorder. They're psychopaths, sociopaths, narcissistic personality disorders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's one common belief. And here's another nice depiction of, is your boss a psychopath? Okay, so the other is that they're not mentally disordered, but they're just morally disordered. They're not crazy, they're evil. So they wake up in the morning and they think of gleefully of how they can torment their coworkers, and that they're predators, and that the coworkers are their prey, that they love to do evil. Okay, so mentally disordered, morally disordered, or the third is they're just plain you-know-whats. And I'm not going to read the title of this book because I did once during a presentation, and I was told afterwards in the feedback that I had used bad language. So I'll just let you read it. So mentally disordered, morally disordered, or they're just plain you-know-whats, okay? Those are the theories of why they behave so badly with their coworkers. And here's some of the common assumptions that once I really started studying them and looking at the popular literature. One was that they are fully aware of the nature and impact of their abrasive behaviors. The common assumption, they know exactly what they're doing, and they know exactly what the impact is of it on their coworkers, whether peers or subordinates. Another common assumption is that their intent is malevolent. Why do they do it? They do it because they're evil and they want to harm people. And how do they do it? What are the means? Well, they do it by dominating, by exerting control through aggression or intimidation. Okay, and finally, another common assumption is that this behavior is intractable. It's so ingrained, they cannot change, it's hopeless. Now, remember, I started talking to abrasive leaders before I knew anything about them. And so when I would go in and I'll talk about the method in more detail, but when I would interview their coworkers and I'd hear about all these awful things they did, I'd take this data, purge it of identifying information, put it into themes, and bring it back to the abrasive leader. And their reactions absolutely controverted this, because what I discovered was, through my research with them, is they had little or no awareness of the nature and impact of their abrasive behaviors. They're clueless. When they would see this feedback, they would go into shock. They would say things like, I can't believe people think I want to hurt them or humiliate them. That's not my intent. That's not what I'm trying to do. So they were so unaware, and it was so shocking to them, and for many, very embarrassing, and many were very remorseful as soon as they saw this kind of extensive and quite detailed feedback. The intent was not to do harm. It was to do what it takes to get the job done. So, it's like, hey, yeah, I have to kick ass, or I gotta, ride people hard to get the job done. And what I discovered was that they want to be perceived as competent. Well, that's not odd. I mean, don't we all want to be perceived as competent? I know I do. But what happens is, if something threatens that self-perception of competence, they get really shook up and they feel very threatened and afraid. They don't look afraid, they look domineering and intimidating, but they in fact are afraid, and they're usually not aware of it at the beginning. They're not aware of what's going on inside of them. Now, how they defend against the threat of being perceived to be incompetent, the means is, again, to dominate or exert control through aggression or intimidation. And what I also discovered is this behavior is coachable. These people can change. I'm not going to say that every single person can change, but I think we run about 82%. The members of the Boss Whispering Institute, myself, I would say about 82% of the clients we work with can change and can turn around their management style, because they're cognitively usually very bright people, or they wouldn't be in the positions they're in if they weren't. And so they're cognitively intelligent, but they're not emotionally intelligent. But if you give them some tools, they can develop that emotional intelligence, and I'll describe that in more detail, pretty quickly. It was surprising to me how rapidly they could internalize the concepts I was sharing and turn around their management style. Now, I just want to differentiate adequate leaders versus abrasive leaders. So what I found is, what adequate leaders do is they'll encounter a problem. Report isn't getting written fast enough. We're not making enough progress on this project. Somebody's struggling to produce what they've been asked to produce. They see a problem. But what they then do is they explore the cause of the problem. Why aren't the reports getting written on time? Or why aren't we dealing with this issue? And so they'll get curious. And what they'll find out is, gee, either the employee is unable to do it because of lack of training, or, they don't know how, or sometimes they'll just find out that the employee is unwilling to do it. Okay, so they find out why is this problem going on, and then they calmly address the problem. If it's an issue of the employee being unable, they could provide, better resources or training. And if the employee is unwilling to do the work that's being asked, then they use a disciplinary process. They set limits. They say, you cannot continue to produce this poor quality of work, and if you do, there will be consequences, and whatever those are, termination, demotion, whatever. So that's what adequate leaders do. But let me show you what abrasive leaders do. And I use a grizzly bear here because in my book I describe my encounters with grizzly bears up in Alaska. I actually intimidated a grizzly bear once. So after that experience, I'm not intimidated by abrasive leaders. That was kind of the great training ground. But what do abrasive leaders do? Well, they see the problem too. Let's say reports not getting written quickly enough, or I'm not getting good input from my management team. And what do? They diagnose incompetence. They don't think deeply. They don't get curious and explore it. They just decide that people are stupid or lazy. And they attack this incompetence. So they dominate through intimidating threat displays. You know how gorillas will beat their chests, or in the case of grizzly bears, they'll show their teeth. It's a threat display to intimidate you and get you to back off. And the reason animals do this is because they feel threatened. And so they'll do a threat display before they actually attack. And what I came to understand was that abrasive leaders see a problem, they're very reactive, people must be stupid or lazy, and then they attack. Okay. And, this is oftentimes referred to as bullying. Now, as I said, I trained as a psychotherapist. And you don't need to be a psychotherapist to do this coaching at all. I wondered that at first when I started my training program. But let me ask you, what does a mouse feel when it sees a cat? It feels threatened, okay? And it feels fear. And what can a mouse do to defend against the threat of the cat? What can a mouse do? Well, the mouse can run away. It can defend by fleeing, right? Flight. And if mice had little tiny machine guns or little pencils or something that were sharp enough, the other defense mechanism is fight. So this threat provokes anxiety, provokes defense. Here it is. Threat provokes anxiety, provokes defense, and defense is fight or flight. This concept actually was developed by Sigmund Freud, who was originally a biologist. And he observed this behavior in animals, in animal behavior. So when a mouse sees a cat, it feels threatened and it's anxious and it defends through flight. Other animals may defend with fight. And these are the most primitive, basic instincts that we see in the animal kingdom. But Freud's great breakthrough was he was saying this doesn't just exist in the animal kingdom. This isn't just a physical phenomenon. It's a psychological phenomenon. So that when I feel threatened, my anxiety level goes up and I defend through fight or flight. So when we think about abrasive behavior, it's defensive behavior. It's anxiety in response to perceived threat. They feel threatened. The threat is that they're afraid of being perceived to be incompetent. This drives up their anxiety level, and they defend primarily through fight. Now, you may have coached some bosses who flee. We call those avoidant leaders. They go to their office, they don't deal with anything, they're conflict avoidant, they don't make decisions. That's the flight mode. Now, this concept of threat, anxiety, defense is what I use in coaching. Again, what are they afraid of? What's a threat? They're afraid of being, I spelled that wrong, not being perceived as incompetent. And another way to describe it is these are insecure leaders. Secure leaders are very confident, and if anybody threatens them or challenges their ideas or threatens their ideas, they can stay very calm and work it through. Not these people. They get shook up easily and they're insecure. So if we sort of correlate the laws of the wilderness and the workplace, what I found through my experience with both is that bears and abrasive leaders just want to go about their business. You know, they want to fish and eat berries, or they want to make the big numbers and bring in the big projects. They want to go about their business, and their business is survival. Okay, and not only to survive, but also to thrive. And that's true. We all go to work and we want to survive and thrive. And what they've learned is that dominance pays. So if I can be bigger and more intimidating, then I am more fit in this habitat, and it guarantees my chances for survival. And if anything threatens their survival, they defend against these threats, whether in the wild or the workplace, with aggression. And you will pay if you get in their way. Okay, so this is what they taught me. And if you ever want to read my doctoral dissertation, they'll use this language. They'll say, boy, it just, when anybody, comes on my turf and doesn't get the job done, it just drives me to the point where I want to, rip their, well, there was some kind of graphic language, but this is what's going on. So abrasive behavior is defensive behavior, all right? And now, since I've given you this little mini lesson in psychoanalytic principle of the ego and mechanisms of defense, so let's say an employee calls a coworker stupid. Okay, you're stupid. Would you call that fight or flight? And in analyzing, it's fight mode. So they're getting aggressive. What threat are they fighting or defending against? Let's say an employee storms out of a meeting. Would you call that fight or flight? Well, yeah, flight. They're fleeing something that they want to get out of that room. And so using this lens to threat, anxiety, defense to analyze abrasive behavior gives everyone more insight into underlying anxiety. And this is what I teach to the abrasive leaders. I use the cat, I use the mouse, and so if they say to me, yeah, I just wanted to rip this guy's, eyeballs out, then I'll say, would you call that fight or flight? And what was the threat that was driving you to do that? All right, so the coaching focuses on observing fight or flight behaviors at work and analyzing them. And it's not only the leader's fight or flight behaviors, but also their coworkers. Now, the good news is we have a third option because we have these bigger brains. We don't just have fight or flight as our options for responding to threat. What we have is a third option called working through. So if there's some threat, let's say the department, we're not going to meet our deadline because of computer breakdowns, that's going to stir a lot of anxiety. And instead of me attacking my team or avoiding them, what I'm going to do as a leader is I'm going to sit down with them, calmly discuss it, and we're going to work it through. We're going to calmly come up with some alternate plan. And this is what you see with confident leaders, that no matter what happens, they stay calm and they manage everybody else's anxiety for the best result. Another point I want to make is that we can all be abrasive. And, if you think of a moment when you behaved abrasively, did you do it in fighting or fleeing? And what was the anxiety that was driving that? What threat was causing your anxiety? So this is what we help our clients do. We help them start to analyze their own and others' behavior using this concept. It's one of the two pillars of the coaching method. And so hopefully when anybody experiences a threat and feels this anxiety, instead of being these, primitive Neanderthals attacking each other, well, we can just sit down and calmly talk about it, whatever the threatening issue is. What are some other contributors to abrasive behavior? One is family interactive styles. Many individuals have grown up in a harsh environment where abrasive styles were acceptable and normal. I had one client, a VP, who said, look, my dad kicked my ass and look where I am today. I'm vice president. So to him, behaving this way was normal. That's how it worked in our family. Cultural styles. As you well know, cultures vary in what might be considered acceptable versus abrasive behavior. So what's acceptable in one culture might be abrasive in another, and we can call this cultural abrasion. And I'm sure in your multinationals, you've dealt with, you know, these people who come in from one culture and start subjecting everybody to their cultural style, and they're kind of clueless that it's not going over very well and that they're perceived as abrasive. Another contributor is that some people hold the misconception that, hey, if I'm direct, you know, that excuses abrasive behavior. You know, like, hey, I don't believe in sugarcoating things, and we have to cut to the chase here. So I'm going to be really direct and, you know, really brutal. And also, many times people don't know how to work through issues. They don't know how to manage their emotions, and they don't have effective non-abrasive alternatives. And so out of ignorance, they just default to this more primitive abrasive style, resorting to aggression. So if an employer tells an abrasive leader, be nicer, or be more sensitive, or look, get the job done without alienating everybody, they don't know how. They know no better way. And finally, many people focus solely on the deliverables. So the leader is, he or she's unaware of the impact of the behavior. And it's kind of this mentality of, look, I'm here to get the job done and not mess with all this touchy-feely stuff. Like, emotions are just immaterial. And they don't realize that the emotional dynamics are so destructive as a result of their behavior. So I found that they were really blinder than bats. They didn't see it. They didn't get it. And so looking at this more deeply, they lack what we would call social sonar. And in the literature, this is called empathic capacity. Empathic capacity is the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and kind of accurately imagine what they're going through. Okay? And we therapists and coaches, we're really good at that. We're very able to kind of put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and imagine their experience. No, these people are not. They don't read emotions. Many of them just don't pay any attention to emotions, or even if they detect emotions in others, they kind of just minimize it or devalue it. You know, hey, leave your emotions at the door. So emotions aren't important. And just quickly, I mean, I do a whole nother seminar for upper management on how to manage abrasive behavior. But a question I had, that second question about why doesn't upper management intervene? Why didn't leadership do something about the abrasive leader in their organization? And what I found is that, contrary to the belief that they don't care, or, you know, they're just kind of evil leaders up above, what I found out was a lot of them are afraid and feel hopeless and helpless. They're afraid of being harmed. So if I talk to Bob, you know, the abrasive leader, and I tell him to, you know, that we're getting lots of complaints, he's got to turn this around and it's causing problems, Bob may attack me. Or he may sabotage the work, or he may be very valuable to us and decide he's going to quit. Or the fear of doing harm, which is, you know, Mary she's worked for me for 20 years. She's going through a divorce. I know people are telling me they can't stand working for her, but she's been loyal to me and I don't want to cause her harm. So this goes on. Another is that management may not do anything because maybe they tried something in the past and it didn't work. So they may have sent the person off to some kind of management training, which does not work with these individuals because they sit in the back row and say, why am I here? I'm not abrasive. I have better things to do with my time. And also, when they did try to intervene, these people tend to vehemently deny that they're abrasive, again, because they're blind, they don't see it. Another reason is many times leadership thinks, oh, I can't do anything unless I have actual factual evidence. you know, unless I saw it or was there. And, you know, people are just coming to me with a lot of hearsay. And what I train leadership is that, look, you have to pay attention to these negative perceptions, because these negative perceptions are very damaging, very disrupting, and you can intervene and sit down with the abrasive leader. And we do a lot of this work in Boss Whispering, where we help leadership work through their own fears about intervening and help them plan how they're going to talk to the individual, how they're going to set limits and consequences, and offer them the help of specialized coaching. Another belief is, oh, people can't change. You know, Bob's always been that way. He can't change. Well, I disagree, because I've seen so many people change their management styles, and, you know, adults can change if they're motivated. Most of them, not all, but most. And finally, leadership often believes that the only thing they can do to end this workplace bullying is terminate the person, which is not the case. You can offer them specialized coaching, and it's really thrilling to see what happens. So in our work as Boss Whisperers, we bring hope and empowerment so that they feel empowered to intervene. Now, let's get down to the actual coaching, shall we? As I said, one role we play is helping management overcome their anxieties about intervening. But now let's talk about the coaching. Why is it specialized? All right. Well, Boss Whispering is actually action research. And what is action research? Action research is self-reflective inquiry undertaken by participants in social situations. Let me give you an example. There was some place in Asia where the infants were not thriving. Some infants were thriving. I forget what country it was. And it was, you know, maybe 30, 40 years ago. And other infants were not thriving. And so what happened was, instead of just researchers coming in and looking at it, they engaged the mothers in the research and said, will you research with us why some of these infants are thriving and others are not? So this is the participants were people who are actually involved in the phenomenon, all right? And so action research. Let's see. So what happens in Boss Whispering? Boss Whispering has 3 objectives with the client, the abrasive client, and it's designed to answer 3 questions. One is, what are the negative perceptions about your management style? Because if we don't know what they are, we cannot eliminate them. And most abrasive leaders, they don't have a good, clear, specific picture of what they do and say that generates these negative perceptions and alienates the coworkers. Like I said, they're clueless. So most times when they end up on my doorstep or on a Boss Whisperer's doorstep, they'll say things like, they told me that I'm alienating people. They told me that they're getting complaints that I don't treat people respectfully and that people don't want to work with me, but they didn't give me specifics. And well, the reason the employer is not giving specific behaviors is because it might identify the complainants. So those people who are the suffering ones coming in to complain, you know, management's hesitant to go into detail. Secondly, they may not do thorough research themselves on what are the negative perceptions. So when the client comes to me and says, I don't understand why I've been referred to you, and they say I have to turn this around, and they say that if I don't turn it around, there are going to be consequences, you know, they're going to fire me or demote me or whatever, and they wouldn't even tell me what people were saying about me. So for a Boss Whisperer to be able to say, hey, how about this? How about if we work as co-researchers, you and I, you engage me kind of as your research assistant, and I'll interview, you know, a group of coworkers and bring that data back to you, that research data, so you and I know exactly what are the negative perceptions, you know, so it's very clear. The second thing in the Boss Whispering process is what's causing them. So when I'm talking with a prospective client, I'll say, look, engage me as a co-researcher. I'll bring you back very specific data, purged of identifying information. So it does not include it doesn't identify who participated. But I'll come back and we'll have very clear data. That's a very appealing proposition. I mean, wouldn't you want to know if people were saying that you're abrasive and they don't want to work with you? Wouldn't you want to know why? So I say, let's work together in a research process. So I'll bring back the negative perceptions, and then I, as a coach, can be very helpful to you to answer the question of what's causing them. And then you and I, the third thing we're going to work on is what strategies can we develop to eliminate these negative perceptions permanently so they do not come and jeopardize your career. So those are the 3 steps of boss whispering. Now, as I said before, these people, they're poor empathizers, and they tend not to have a lot of psychological insight. They just don't, unlike us. So let me give you an example. I had a CEO who was a brilliant guy. I interviewed his coworkers. This guy was brilliant. And when I interviewed his senior management team, I learned about him. But anyway, he says to me, he says, I don't get it. He says, when I ask my team for input, no one speaks up. Okay, so as coaches, we get curious. And so I asked him, I said, why do you think that is? Why do you think nobody speaks up when you ask for input? Remember, this is a cognitively brilliant guy. And he said, because they're lazy. And I'm like, oh boy, is he off? Is he off? So I said, okay, that's theory number 1 or hypothesis number 1. They're lazy. All right. I didn't judge it. I said, so you have one hypothesis that they're lazy. I said, can you think of any other reason that they don't speak up when you ask for input? They're stupid. And I encountered this over and over and over again. So I knew why they didn't speak up because, of course, I'd interviewed them. Well, because they were afraid, But anyway, he didn't know that. And so I said, let's go for a third one. Can you think of any other reason they might not speak up, that they clam up when you ask for input? And this cognitively brilliant man, photographic memory, global CEO, he thought about it and he thought about it. And he finally said, well, I've been told I can be kind of critical. And I said, great. Hypothesis number 3, they're afraid. Oops, I'm going to go back. Well, I can't go back. They're afraid. Oh, yeah, they're lazy. They're stupid. Oh. So this should show the third theory. They're afraid. And he said to me, he said, what do you mean they're afraid? And I said, well, the third hypothesis, they might be afraid to speak up. And he said to me, why would they be afraid? I'm not afraid to speak up. Now, what that told me was he didn't have much psychological insight. He wasn't putting himself in their shoes and thinking, what's it like for them to deal with me? Physically imposing, brilliant CEO, critical, shreds everything they say, tears it apart. So I said, let's use a scientific method and test the third hypothesis, that they're afraid. I said, next time you have a management meeting, why don't you, if they, ask them for input, and if anybody says anything, refrain from saying anything critical, refrain from criticizing. And he immediately said, well, I don't want to agree with stupid ideas. And I said, no, I'm not asking you to agree with any of the ideas, but I want you to test this by refraining from saying anything critical. And he says, well, like what? And I said, oh, you could say, tell me more, or why is that? Or, on what do you base, whatever the team member was saying. So you're not criticizing, you're just getting curious and exploring. Oh, all right. He comes back a week later and he says, I cannot believe it. I said, what? He said, they all spoke up. He said, I realize now, remember that mouse and cat thing? He says, I realize now I'm the cat, that I threaten them. And they go into flight mode. Now see, he's using that threat anxiety defense dynamic. So then the next task is, okay, now that you understand that, cool, they're afraid. How can you reduce the perception of threat? How can you have them not be so afraid that they're going into flight mode? How can you do that? And he started work. He says, well, I can really monitor being critical. And I also explained to him that he had to understand that they're not as bright as he is. This is called the burden of superior intelligence. I'll just tell you, I said to him, look, you've got to realize they're not as intelligent as you are. You are a brilliant man, and I'm not saying that to flatter you, but every single person I've interviewed has said the same thing. And he kind of argued. He said, I'm not brilliant. You know, I'm just another guy who knows a few things. And I really came back at him and I said, as long as you deny that you are brilliant, and that you're just like every other guy, you will expect all of them to be as bright as you, and they're not. It's a lonely place to be in, to be the brightest bear in the bunch. But you know, you have a choice. You can either help them or you can attack them. And man, he developed insight pretty quickly. Now, let me take you through this process. Sort of, what does it look like? There are three phases here. There's at the top this intervention and referral phase, assessment phase, and coaching phase. Okay, so what happens is the phone rings, ding, in your office, and you get a call from what we will call the sponsor. It could be someone from HR or someone in leadership, including the client's manager, but somebody from the employer calls you and says, we have a problem, we need help. Okay, so then I think somebody's not muted here. Casey Lou came in and isn't muted. Yeah, okay, thanks. So yeah, if you could push, there you go, thanks. Okay, so you get a call from the employer, and then what you do is you work with the employer, helping them understand how they're going to intervene with the potential client. How are they going to sit down and say something to the effect of, we're getting a steady stream of negative perceptions about your management style. This cannot continue. You need to turn this around. We're going to offer you help to do that through specialized coaching, and we need to let you know it cannot continue, and if it does, we'll have to look at consequences. That's sort of the summary of the intervention. So then the employer intervenes with the client and provides, you know, your name, the coach's name. Okay, so then what happens is, I'll talk about myself. So I get this call and I help the employer, and the employer sits down with the client, who's not really a client yet because they haven't agreed to the coaching. And they call me, or I call them. And that phone call right here, that initial call, can take an hour or two to answer every single question the client has about how does the process work. Is it confidential? Yes. Are you going to write a report about me? No. Do you share any information back with the employer about me? No, because you have to be able to talk with me without, you know, et cetera. Well, what's involved? And so you explain the whole process of the coaching method with them, answer all of their questions, and then if they agree to go ahead, with the client's permission, you notify the sponsor and manager, in other words, the employer, that you're going to move ahead. Okay, the next step is scheduling coworker interviews, because remember how I talked about being a researcher? What I do is I ask the client, I said, I'd like you to give me a list of names, about 8 to 10 people that I could interview. Many times this is done by telephone or Zoom if I'm not co-located. And I'd like you to give me a list of those coworkers. Okay, so they give me a list of 8 coworkers. And then I tell them, I say, I would like to show this list to your manager or the sponsor to see if they want to add anybody to the list. We call these confidential add-ons. This is a kind of a little twist or complexity, which is, so how do I explain this? They may give me the names of 8 people, but there may be 4 people who came in and complained to the employer who are not on my client's list. Well, I want to talk to those 4 people, and I want to find out what they had to say. And the only way I can find that out is if the employer allows me to interview those people who came to complain. So everything's straightforward with the client, and I say, look, I'd like to show your list to your manager, and if anybody came to complain about you, don't you want to know what those people said? And my client will say, absolutely. And I'll say, the only way I can access that data is if I interview those people, and you would not know who they are. So your employer may add some people to the list, but you would not know who they are. And sometimes they'll say, you mean you're going to interview people that I don't know who you're interviewing? And I say, only those who came to complain to your employer. Don't you want to know what they had to say? At which point they go, yes, I do. This also is a good thing to do, because if they give you a list of 8 and they think, oh, I know exactly who's being interviewed, I know who said what, you can always come back and say, look, I didn't, you're assuming I only interviewed the people that you gave me to interview. But, there may have been some of these confidential add-ons. So it increases the pool of the coworkers. Then I prepare my client to invite his or her list to be part of his or her coaching process. So I give them sample language, which they might send it to their 8 coworkers saying, gee, I'm going to be involved in a leadership development process, and my coach would like to interview you, and would you be willing to participate? I would not know who says what, it would be, and then I also talk to the coworkers about, I'll talk about that in a minute. And then I help the sponsor, the employer, invite the confidential add-ons to participate, to be interviewed by me. Okay, so all these appointments are set up. And in the olden days, I always used to fly in and conduct all these interviews in about a day and a half or 2 days. This is no longer necessary because so much of the work we can now do over good platforms like Zoom. So I do work with the United Nations, and I have clients in Africa, and they can't afford to fly me in there. So, I do all this work over Zoom. But anyway, what happens is when I would arrive on site, I would meet with the client, first time that we're meeting face to face, and I would take a work history. Because there's not much to talk about at that point. You certainly shouldn't start coaching until you know what the negative perceptions are. So I would have the client tell me about their work history. How did they end up doing what they were doing? And this really serves to build a relationship between you and the client, because they become more than just a bag of abrasive behaviors. Then I'd interview coworkers A, B, also the client's manager, coworker D, E, maybe the HR person on day 2, more coworkers. And then what happens is I touch base with the sponsor before I leave, and I also touch base with the client to just let them see that I still like them. Because so many of these clients will think, oh my God, once she interviews my coworkers, she's going to hate me. No, no, no. Okay, and so then what happens is I compile the feedback summary, and I give some time to reflect about that. And this feedback summary is it can be very long, very detailed, and it is in the voices of the coworker. So it's not paraphrased like, many people said that you can be dismissive. Oh no, that's not what it is. It can be page after page of employee verbatim comments saying, we will sit in the meeting and she will single out one person and humiliate them in front of everybody else. She will point out their flaws. That's one comment. And then there'll be another comment about, she doesn't hesitate to point out what people are doing wrong in front of everybody else. Then there's another comment like that. There's another comment. So what happens is the feedback is compiled into themes, okay? And so the themes might be public humiliation, over control, makes threats, doesn't listen, condescending. And then there are all these comments that describe the exact behaviors, what my client does or says, okay? So anyway, then we have the feedback session. And wow, this is the hardest part of the coaching. Oops, I didn't want to go there. Because this is where they see and they realize how serious it is and how much distress they're causing, and they really go into shock. So we really need to be prepared to be supportive of them, to say, this is the worst part, I'm here to help, we can turn this around. And many times they'll say, am I the worst person you've ever worked with? And it's like, please, no, we can turn this around. All right, and so finally we go into coaching, which is, again, you don't want to mishandle these. So what we do is we pick the most urgent theme to work on, the client and I. So maybe there's one where poor emotional control. He will, he will lose his temper at the drop of a hat and start yelling. And second comment, the slightest thing sets him off. You'll never know what it's going to be. And next thing you know, he's stomping around and yelling. These are kind of extreme cases. So let's say we pick that as the first theme. And then what I do is very quickly in the first or second session, I introduce this TAD dynamic that I showed you. Okay, threat, anxiety, defense. And then, so he'll look at the feedback and he'll say, well, yeah, I do lose my temper. I do stamp around. It really makes me upset when people don't put the equipment away. It causes a safety problem. So then I'll say, well, would you call your stomping around and yelling, would you call that fight or flight? Well, fight. And what's behind that? What's the threat? Well, the threat is that somebody will get hurt. And that, makes me anxious. So I fight to get the equipment put away. And what they learn is that it's so counterproductive to go into fight mode, but they start analyzing themselves. And boy, they get it pretty quickly. And then I say, so when you stomp around and yell at people, what happens? And they say, well, they just clam up. They won't say anything, and then that's it. And I say, now, do you call that fight or flight behavior? And they'll say flight. And I'll say, so your objective is to get them to put the safety equipment away, but what's happening is you're getting people to clam up and see you as the bad guy, the threat. So let's you and I work on what other strategies could we develop to help them understand the need to put the safety equipment away, or whatever it is. The other, and I'm gonna talk about the insight cycle in a moment. So I'm getting to the end here, folks. Have patience with me. About 3 to 4 months later, usually about 6, 7 sessions, because this coaching goes very quickly, shockingly quickly, because they're bright people. I will go back and re-interview the coworkers, all the people I originally interviewed, and I'll ask them the same interview question, which is, could you share with me your current perceptions of the strengths and weaknesses of Bob's management style? And so then I do the same process. I take that feedback, purge it of identifying information, and it's wonderful to take that back because they get to see the fruit of their labors. They get to see feedback that says he stopped swearing entirely. It is such a relief that he doesn't swear anymore. Or I can see she's really working to control her temper. It's not perfect, but it means a lot to me that she's really trying, to handle things in a different way. So this is why this coaching can be, so enjoyable. So, we get that pulse check data, and we either do a little more work, or it may be we don't need to do any more work. So then we'll conclude the coaching, check in with the sponsor, tell them the coaching's going to conclude, and then discuss a follow-up plan and have them select some future internal feedback providers so that they can get feedback internally if they ever start behaving abrasively again. So the steps are, got to move very quickly to establish a trusting alliance with the client. And they're anxious, they're defensive, they can get aggressive with you. And what you say is, I'd like you to engage me as your co-researcher so we can discover the exact nature of these damaging negative perceptions and determine what generates them. Once we do that, we can work to develop strategies to eliminate these negative perceptions. So I'm never calling them abrasive or abusive or convicting them of management crimes. I'm talking about negative perceptions that are causing them problems. This is a confidential process. I don't share our findings or work with anyone. Step 2, I talked about the coworker assessment. They're individually interviewed by the coach. Data's purged of identifying information. Here's some typical themes: over controls, doesn't listen. So the client learns exactly what he or she does or says that generates interpersonal distress. They learn what the negative perceptions are and what's causing them, and then we decide which theme we're going to work on first. And so this is what a publicly humiliates theme might look like. He will dress people down with other employees present. He told one person they were worthless. If someone makes a mistake, he'll bring it up in meetings. He'll say, how did you ever come up with a stupid idea like that? Et cetera, et cetera. So it's not me trying to convince them that they're abrasive. It's the employees' voices coming through. Look at this last one. People are terrified to say anything. They just clam up. In other words, they go into flight mode. So they learn to read and accurately interpret behavior, in other words, develop empathic accuracy using this TAD dynamic. It works. You know, it works, and they love it. They love being able to now analyze behavior and think more deeply about behavior and gain psychological insight. So, you know, here we go. I don't get it. No one speaks up. They're lazy. They're stupid. They're afraid. Now I get it. They're afraid I'll criticize them. So he's accurately empathizing with coworkers. And then the step 4 is developing and testing insightful strategies. So, hey, so what strategies could reduce the perception of threat? How could you achieve your objectives without having to resort to aggression and being seen as the bad guy? Like with public humiliation. Well, they'll say, oh, I realize if I have a problem with someone, I could address it behind closed doors. Because when I would ask them, they'd say, well, yeah, I do these things. I do point out people's errors in front of other people. I do bring it up in meetings, and I do this. And then I'll say, why do you do it? You know, I'm just curious. Why do you do it? And gosh, they'd always say, I'm trying to educate everyone. I want everybody to learn from, you know, people's mistakes. And so then I'd say, well, how's that working for you? And when they're looking at the feedback, they can see it's not. Everybody thinks I'm trying to humiliate them. I'm not. I'm trying to educate them. So then the question is, how could you educate them without being perceived as a threat? And they'll get it right away. They'll say, well, I realize now if I have a problem with someone or someone's making errors, I have to address it behind closed doors. I realize I can't call people names. I realize if I think someone has a stupid idea, I need to bring them around without making them feel stupid. So they shift from attacking to educating. And I talk about this in my book, moving from the crusader for competence off with their heads to the gentle educator. The second tool in this, we've talked about the TAD dynamic. So what you do is, this is called the insight cycle right here, and what they'll observe behavior. They'll say, you know, like the example, nobody speaks up. That's observing behavior. And so then as a coach, I say, why do you think that is? You know, I kind of have this Freudian Viennese accent in my head, but why do you think this is? You know, you say they don't speak up. That he's observing the behavior. What would you call this? Fight or flight? Flight. Why do you think this is? What do you think the anxiety is that drives them to flee? And then we develop a strategy to reduce that anxiety, and we test it. So he went back and refrained from saying everything critical, and lo and behold, he comes back and observes behavior. And he says they all spoke up. And then I say, well, why do you think they all spoke up? He said, because I wasn't threatening them. Hey, insight. This is psychological insight. Wow, the insight cycle. So boss whispering, it requires the employer's willingness to intervene. Okay, so because these people don't see themselves as abrasive, they're not going to call you up independently and say, hey, I'm abrasive, help me. Or it's very rare. So the employer has to put pressure on them to change. It goes very quickly, again, because they're bright people, and you bring them lots of feedback and they really gain insight. I very confidently say to employers, you should see demonstrable change by the 3rd coaching session. And I'll just give you an example of that. I worked with one client, and poor emotional control, right? And he would lose it a lot. And in his mind, losing it, getting angry, swearing at people was a powerful, intimidating, grizzly bear kind of threat display, you know? But when he saw the feedback, the feedback said things like, he will lose his emotional control at the drop of a hat. He's like an infant having a temper tantrum. And you know what? My client never lost his temper again, because he managed to control it, work on that with my help, because he realized what he thought were these wonderful, intimidating threat displays were actually viewed as infantile temper tantrums, and he did not want to be perceived to be an infant. I would say around 82% achieve an acceptable level of conduct. Oh, this should say new research. Again, I can't spell today. New research that's just come out, fellow researcher here in Portland discovered that coaching clients retain this insight and this ability to manage their emotions. So it has a lasting effect. So again, I've covered this already. Client invites coworkers to be interviewed. We give them anonymized theme feedback. It's given to the client only, not to the employer. We introduce a TAD dynamic to develop insight. We work on insight-based management strategies. We do a pulse check, a second round of coworker interviews, and the coaching concludes. Now, as I tell employers, what are the advantages of intervening and referring someone for specialized coaching? Well, first of all, employee suffering ends. And it is so thrilling when you do these pulse check interviews and they talk about how much better it is and how the employees aren't suffering. The employees are heartened that the formerly abrasive leader cared enough to work to change. It means a lot, and it has a tremendously therapeutic effect, a healing effect on the group. The employees regard the employer positively for intervening. You know, like, thank God they finally did something, and thank God they cared enough about us to bring in this coach. The formerly abrasive leader is grateful for the employer's willingness to invest in him or her and offer a second chance through coaching, particularly when they're just about getting ready to fire the person. And the employer reduces the potential for litigation, attrition, anti-management sentiment. And guess what? The employer gets to keep the leader's technical expertise. So they don't lose their great software writer or their, wonderful salesperson or whatever. But what happens if the heading should come up here and it say, what happens if the leader can't change and has to be terminated? Well, guess what? Employee suffering ends. Employees regard the employer positively for intervening. They reduce the potential for litigation, and the employer has the peace of mind of knowing that they did everything in their power to remedy the situation. They did everything they could. So that happens if termination. So, sorry. I don't know. I didn't have enough coffee this morning when I was putting these together. So I've come to the end. Guess what? And if you have any questions, you can email me, crawshaw@bosswhispering.com, but I want to hear all your questions now. I do offer a self-paced online course because I got kind of tired of traveling to different parts of the world and conducting. And if you have an interest in looking at the course, you can go to this link. And take a look, and it shows self-paced online, includes videos and text, and it's really a cookbook in great detail about how to do it. And the bottom line is, I made all the mistakes you could ever make developing this method, and so you're not going to make the same mistakes I did. Now, also, if you want to read an article that I wrote using action research, you can go to the website www.bosswhispering.com and you can download this article. It's on our research and publications page, so you can download that for free. So gosh, I've been talking a lot, so let me stop sharing the screen and start sharing with you, and let's unmute everybody and just have a great conversation, okay?
Hi, Laura. This is Jess Malani.
Hi.
Hi. This was a really fantastic resource for us as coaches, because
Good.
we do have some of the signs that you mentioned, and I love the way that you've really generously shared everything. So great stuff.
My mission is to relieve suffering in the workplace caused by abrasive leaders. And so if I can have every coach in the world aware of how to help with this, it's very satisfying. So
absolutely, I want to applaud you for that.
Yeah.
My question is, given the cultural difference that we have in Asia, the bosses may not be showing the abrasive behavior in the way that is shouting, screaming,
Right, and those are more extreme scenarios. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So there is a tendency that this behavior is seen as a passive aggressive way. And what you shared is about them feeling that they're being noble and they're doing all this because it's necessary to get the results that they seek. And now that you're an expert in working with these individuals, what is it that can be done for us to be able to identify this? And I say this because in some of the chemistry checks that we have, there is a tendency that when we see the assessment report, or we have received the client's information that this is possibly a case of abrasive leadership here, if I am the coach and I land up, sharing that we need to do something like this, and they are in denial.
Right.
So that's a real challenge that I face.
Okay.
Yeah. So anything that you'd like to say? And the second question that I'd like to know is, from the coaching process that you shared, the learning methodology and awareness, how does it tie with the ICF methodology, the credentialing? Yeah.
Okay. The course is approved, I think, for 24 CEUs or something, and the majority of them are the ones you want, not the resource development. I can't remember which ones, but in that course description it talks about that. But so this is an ICF accredited course, and ICF holds that we don't lecture, we don't teach, we don't put our solutions in our clients' mouths. Instead, what we do is we get curious. Right. And really explore what their objectives are, what's going on with them. And so this accords with that, because in the coaching process, I'm not lecturing, I'm not telling them what to do, I'm just getting very curious about what are the negative perceptions, what causes them, and what can you and I do as far as developing strategies to eliminate them. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but
yes, it does.
It does it? Okay. Yeah. Can you, when you talk about a kind of passive aggressive, can you just paint a picture of a case you heard of, or the behaviors of a leader that were this, what did the leader do that was, passive aggressive? Can you think of any, or if anybody can think of any?
In particular case that I have coached this individual, but I'm referring to when the client was introduced. The feedback that I received from everyone is absolutely brilliant, intelligent, but unable to get people to work because of the low emotional intelligence, was pushing people to get the numbers, which is a great thing for the organization. But however, they didn't see that as a tendency for him to develop further into senior leadership roles. So they wanted to do some corrective intervention.
Okay, so their complaints, if or what they present with, is he has low emotional intelligence. And my question in talking with them is, what does that mean? What does he do or say? What does he do or say that reflects that? Because telling someone you have low emotional intelligence is not helpful. The kind of feedback that we bring back is very helpful, because they get to see exactly what they do or say. The other complaint they had was that he pushes people for the numbers. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But they hadn't. There was some reason they weren't quite happy with that. What was happening that they weren't saying, yeah, he pushes and that's great? What was he doing?
The actual behavior was that he was sending 200 emails.
Would you call that fight or flight?
I really...
Come on.
That was total core evidence, which really helped me to build a relationship. And I can tell you that in a year's time now, whole organization has seen a tremendous difference in him. His whole relationships with his family and everything has improved. So I did the process without knowing that this is what I'm doing.
But let me point out
but that at that time, it was 200 emails about any one thing, checking in on Saturday, Sunday, and calling the project lead that I want this information and I want it now because I'm going to meet the client on Monday morning.
So very anxious, right? Over controlling. So what you see me asking, is that fight or flight? And what he's doing with 200 emails, that's fight behavior. He's fighting to get everything under control, okay?
Yeah.
And if you back into that, what is the anxiety? He has a lot of anxiety, and what is the threat? And the threat is that he will be perceived to be incompetent. So he has to hound everybody, nag everybody, which drives people practically insane and alienates them, because their experience is, he doesn't trust me, he's treating me like a child, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so let me go back. So this method can be used to help him in a very supportive way analyze his behavior. And what we find over and over again is the majority of these people treat themselves as badly as they treat their coworkers. They flog themselves. Many of them are perfectionists. They grew up in homes where they had to be top performers because they risk losing the love of a parent because of that. And it's happened so often toward the end of the coaching that my client will say to me, they'll look at me and they'll go, you know, I realize now how hard I've been on myself, and how hard I push myself, and you know, I realize that I'm not perfect. And what I would say to them is, I'd say, welcome to the human race, you know, welcome, come on and join the club, because they suffer as much as they have other people suffering. Now, let me get back to this. You mentioned the chemistry. So how do referrals usually come to you? The employer sends you, there's been some pre-testing or pre-assessment, or how, just describe how you get referral, what they do.
So the client has identified the leader with
the employer. The employer
has
identified the leader.
Identified. And so the usual intervention is that the assessment is done.
By whom?
By the HR.
HR does some kind of assessment, correct?
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
And so they have also got feedback because of their surveys and, you know, usual so they've done some intervention. Which
is nice.
But they come to the conclusion that this is got to be handled by an external coach.
Right, got it.
So that's where they identify a few of us, and we go for the chemistry check.
And you use what do you call it? The chemistry?
Chemistry check. Chemistry check.
Okay, this is one issue, which is we are specialists. All right.
Yeah.
We are not generalist coaches. This is a very specific specialty. Okay. And so if an employer says to me, well, we're going to have Bob talk with you and 2 other coaches, all right? What I say to them is, I say, well, I can tell you right now, Bob's not going to pick me. Why? You know, we want the chemistry. I'll say, because most of these people are in denial. They don't see themselves as abrasive. And so when I propose that I conduct research with them by interviewing their coworkers, they're going to go into flight mode, and they would much rather work with a coach who's just going to sit with them and not talk to the employees. All right. So what I advise employers, I say, you may want to do these chemistry interviews with non-abrasive leaders, but if you want this process to work, you need to refer them to a specialist, and you need to skip the chemistry interview. I mean, it's, for instance, if you have 5 general practitioners in town and 1 neurosurgeon, right? And the person needs brain surgery, you're not going to refer them for a chemistry interview with 1 neurosurgeon and the 2 general practitioners. So so we discussed that in our monthly meetings of the Boss Whispering Institute. You need to be really you need to educate the employers, and you know that the employer needs to offer the help of a specialist. Okay. And say, we are willing to pay for you to see, you know, this specialist coach, because we believe this coach who specializes in working with leaders who have negative perceptions about their management style. That's what we're willing to do. Okay. So,
awesome.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That helps.
There you go.
Okay.
Next question.
I'm opening the floor to the others. I do have some things, but I need to articulate it more.
Hi there, Laura. This is Harry Marshall.
Yes.
My question, just sorry, I'm hearing
sure
an echo of myself. So.
Sorry, maybe my name is Catherine. If I can shortly just squeeze in with a question, and I apologize for not actually putting my camera on. I was
okay, and then we'll come back. We'll come back to you, Harry. All right?
Yeah. Sorry, just
sure.
while you were mentioning before, as a specialist, if I just thought, even when you went through the whole process with us, if I market it or even put myself as a specialist already, and I want to make it as transparent to a certain degree, and still want, once I interview these co-workers or employees or subordinates, that this is some kind of leadership coaching. But for example, if they do some research and right away find out that I'm a specialist on abrasive,
in working with abrasive leaders,
exactly.
That's on your website, right?
Correct, exactly.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, well, what
go
impact or effect would that have on?
Okay, we have a boss whispering code, and one part of the code is we always tell the truth. All right, and not necessarily all of it, but we. And so what happens is when a potential client says to me, well, what if people look up and see, I'm a kind of rare bird because this is all I do. So many of you may be, more generalist coaches, but you also work with abrasive leaders, all right? So that's one way to handle it and say, well, if people come to the website, they're going to see that I do, different kinds of leadership coaching and part of that is working with abrasive leaders. Where you'll encounter the resistance is not from the coworkers, because they'll be delighted that you're coming in because they all know this person is abrasive. But your question's very well taken. What if the client says, well, they're all going to see that and think that you're coming in to work with me because I'm, an abrasive leader. And so the way I handle that is I'll say, look, I work with leaders who have negative perceptions about their management style. Would you agree there are negative perceptions about your management style because you referred to me? And they can't deny that. They're like, well, yeah. And I said, and I'm here to help. And I haven't talked with your employees yet, but my guess is there are some of them who do perceive you to be abrasive, that this is not going to be a surprise to them. And it's difficult to look at your own leadership style. And, ultimately, I suppose you can elect not to work with me, but I'm here to help. I want to help you eliminate these negative perceptions. So, that's kind of the best answer I can give.
Okay. But thanks again for sharing that as well. Very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Harry?
Yes, hello. I fixed my technology now. I can't hear myself, which is good. So Laura, thank you so much for your talk. It's been really, really fantastic. My question was, I'm just curious about the contracting that you go into with the sponsor, and what agreements that you have as to their, or what expectations you set with them, and how you manage those expectations for what happens after the coaching ends. So as general coaches, to sort of use your term, we're always, I'm always very in tune, and it's a red flag for me if I hear please come in and fix this person, which in a sense, this is sort of coaching of that nature.
Right.
I guess I would be nervous to work with a client who just wanted a hand off this whole issue to me as the specialist intervention coach, and off you go, you fix this person.
Off you go. I call those and
we expect you to fix them. So
yes, I call those, Harry, I call those the miracle worker referrals, where they call you up and say, and they'll say, well, we have this, abrasive, and they'll describe these behaviors. And I'll say, well, have you like talked to the person? What have you done so far? That's, and in the course, I show all the questions you need to ask the employer. How long has it been going on? Who did they behave this way? What interventions have you tried before? How did they respond? What do you think you're doing now? And so I'll ask something like, well, have you talked to the person about your concerns? Well, no. We want you to do that. And that's, this is where the intervention education comes in, which is what I will say to them. I'll say, first of all, nobody's going to listen to a coach. I don't work there. This individual's not going to listen. And it's what you need to do is you need to sit down and talk with this individual about your concerns. You need to think through how you're going to phrase this. And let me also ask you, what if they don't turn this around? What are you prepared to do? Are you prepared to live with this for another 20 years? Or would you terminate the person or demote them or move them to a non-man? Well, we've never thought about that. And so you get them to think about that in advance. But if they say, we don't want to do all that, we just want to send, the client, to you, and, you work your miracle. What I say to them is I say, you know what? Unfortunately, the method will not work. It will not work unless you do your piece. And I'd be glad to talk with you and talk with so-and-so, and we can all have a conference call or get together and talk. But because these individuals they're not aware that they're abrasive, and you've even had the experience of trying to talk to Bob, and he pushed back and said that's not the case. So I'm not going to be able to motivate this individual to change. The only time this method with these individuals, the employer needs to motivate them to change. So I hate to tell you, but if you don't do that, the method will not work. I don't say, I can't do it, I can't work a miracle. I just say the method will not work. And they're like, really? So, and I never would ever accept a referral under those circumstances where they just want to ship it to me, because Harry, you predicted it'd be disastrous. You're sitting there, why am I here? Well, your boss says you're abrasive. Well, what did they say about me? Well, they didn't go into generalities. Well, I'm not abrasive, and I'm going to spend the next 10 sessions convincing you why I'm not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, absolutely.
We really have to educate the employer on their role. And by the way, it is an employer's role to manage not only performance, but also conduct. So I've developed this course for management employers where I go in, like I was given this course last week at NASA, to all these manager rocket scientists, and they really love the course on how to manage abrasive behavior. So that's something that we specialist coaches, learn to do very well, which is help the employer wise up. I'm getting a little aggressive and abrasive, aren't I? Other questions? No?
So, well, I might have another question again. Sorry.
Sure.
There's nobody else currently. I was wondering, because obviously you made pretty clear how to define this abrasive behavior. And from my coaching so far, I have to admit that more of this behavior was not by my coachee, but by their boss. So I had the coachees, which obviously work for abrasive boss. But I was wondering sometimes where even by observing people, how they lead, how they manage, would you say, because there is a difference, I might be wrong, but some of them, they don't show abrasive behavior until they're under real pressure.
Right, until they feel very threatened because of some threat.
Yeah. While there might be others where you think, there is really, there is no need to feel pressure right now. It's not, the numbers are coming in or whatever, but they still kind of abrasive. Do you actually coach them differently if it just is really under extreme circumstances, or would you say that's basically the same behavior just in...
I would say if they're engaged in civil behavior, 80-90% of the time, and it's only under extreme circumstances,
right,
they feel so much anxiety that they start kind of being unable to manage their emotions, and they move into fight mode. I would say in those cases that just whipping out that old threat anxiety defense dynamic, and it takes about 7 minutes to explain it to someone. right? So you explain that, and then
Yeah.
you start getting them to analyze what's going on, and it only occurs rarely. I think chances are pretty good that you wouldn't have to interview all the coworkers, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is, though, he may be telling you, it sounds like he's a he may be telling you, I only lose it, when I'm under a lot of pressure, but that may not be the case. There may be other abrasive behaviors.
Right.
But if you observe this person in the workplace and there aren't a lot of complaints and it's kind of limited to this, I think that threat anxiety defense, having the person have a conceptualization of my anxiety level's really high, there's a part of me that wants to bark and bite. Okay, I'm aware, because awareness brings change. I'm going to manage that. I'm going to talk to my coach about that. I'm going to breathe deeply and move into working through mode. So yeah, I think.
Okay, thanks again for that.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
Laura, I've got a question. So thank you
Sure.
so much for sharing lots of insight. So my question here is around managing the change process, because this whole journey working with the abrasive leader is taking him or her through a change process. So the question is, in the change journey or the change process, there could be different stages of change, right? So there could be the stage of denial, or the leader gets into perhaps depression because now I realize how bad I have been,
Yep.
so guilt-stricken and what have you. So what are there different strategies that coaches could use in dealing with the different sort of state of mind or
Yes.
state of change? Yeah. So if you could
Yes.
share that would be
And
useful. Thank
yes, and unfortunately I cannot, address all of these in an hour and a half, but it certainly is incorporated in the course, such as I'll give you an example. When they go through the feedback with you, we go through it together and I read it to them because I don't want them jumping around. I want them to stay with, and I want to hear the comments. They will say things like, at the beginning, they'll say, I never said that. I didn't do that. That's not true. They've got it wrong, etc. And so that's the denial, they're in denial, and it's normal. We all want to defend against negative perceptions. So what we do is we have an understanding that they're under a lot of stress, that these perceptions are very threatening. We don't challenge that. We don't say, well, that's what they said, or I think you're wrong, and they're in a very supportive mode. We'll say things like, if I believe it, I'll say, I believe you did not intend to humiliate people. But unfortunately, these negative perceptions exist, and I want them to go away. I don't ever want you to be perceived. So it's a very, if I may use the word, loving and supportive intervention. Another moment comes, you mentioned the depression, after they go through the feedback. This is the hardest time. So there's a whole kind of process of statements we make before we go through the feedback, such as, this is the hardest part. Secondly, what you're going to see are perceptions, not necessarily facts. Thirdly, it will get better after this. And once they've gone through all the feedback, they can be so depressed that they'll say things like, I'm thinking of quitting. How do I go back if people see me this way? Or, the worst case scenario would be that they're thinking of suicide. And we even talk about, how to handle that. That's never occurred. But so for instance, I'm thinking of quitting. It's hopeless. And again, I will say, not hopeless at all. Not hopeless. I've worked with, many leaders, and I don't see it as being hopeless at all. And if you're thinking of quitting, could I ask you, before you make such a decision, to give us a chance to do a bit of work, a couple sessions, and see how things go, because I think I can really be helpful to you. And it's sort of like when, if you go in and you get a diagnosis of some terrible disease from your doctor, right? You want your doctor to be there and say, I can help you with this, and it's not the end of the world. So you've accurately pointed out there are different steps on the change process where we have to be right there with them as an ally and as a support, particularly around the feedback. And this research in new research coming out says that was a really pivotal moment. It was a devastating moment to get the feedback. But the purpose of the feedback is it breaks through the denial. So I'm not sitting there arguing with my client for the next 17 sessions on whether they're really perceived to be abrasive or not. You know, the feedback provided that, but we have to be there in a supportive way. We are there to help.
Thank you. No, I really like the fact that, you know, the way to sort of mitigate the reaction or the defensiveness is to say that, you know, the intention and impact, they are different, right? Unfortunately, you know, that's where we are right now.
Yeah, and when they say, I don't mean, and they'll try and defend themselves, and, you know, and I'll say, I believe you. I believe you. Unfortunately, you know, but we're going to work on that. So, yeah, it's great work. It's really rewarding.
Yeah. Great. Sorry, can I just ask a follow-on question? So you mentioned that, you know, we could lend credibility by saying that, you know, we can turn this around because I work with leaders, you know, and with seeing results. So what if we're just starting out, right? So when we're not, perhaps you are my first client, right? So what could we actually say to lend the credibility without, you know, saying that we've actually worked with?
Well, we have going on like 250 members of the Boston Spring Institute worldwide, and this question comes up a lot, you know, and one way to handle that is to say things like, you know, and what I do is I supervise people on their first cases, so they're not just hanging out there on their own. You know, I can do that. But one way to handle that is to say, look, one focus I have is helping leaders who have negative perceptions about their management style. And, you know, I've really trained in this specialty. You know, but you don't, that's where you tell the truth, but not all of it. You say, I've trained in this specialty. However, I've never worked with anyone before. Don't say that part, okay? You know, I have trained in this specialty, and I'm here to help you. So, and then, I don't know, usually they're so upset about their own situation, they don't ask questions like, well, how many people have you coached in this specialty? I don't think anybody's been asked that, you know. And once you start explaining the process, they just feel a sense of like, oh God, somebody's going to help me figure out what the hell is going on here and what we can do about it. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very helpful.
Yes. Other questions?
Hi, Laura. Yeah, I have a small question. So first of all, thank you very much for sharing this. It was great. And
good.
Reminded me of so many examples in my old corporate career in the past. Interesting.
Sounds a bit familiar, eh?
It is.
Mm-hmm.
I really love your, you know, purpose of bringing this training to more people. So thank you very much for that. My question is simple. I don't have a therapist background at all.
Right.
I'm just a trained coach with corporate experience. I have the feeling in how you shared your experience that, in fact, your therapist background was pretty useful. So what do you have to say to people like me?
Yeah.
Who are not trained at all as therapists. But
okay.
Like when you have somebody saying, oh my God, everybody hates me, I want to die now. I will be completely panicked by this kind of stuff.
Well, no, we do cover that in the course. You know, I always like, how do you deal with the very worst case scenario? And, you know, for instance, if they go through the feedback and they say, how can I go back? You know, everybody hates me. I mean, I say things like, okay, I interviewed these people and they don't hate you. Mm-hmm. You know, I will admit there are one or two people who are very distressed. You know, I'm not going to describe who, but so many people were so impressed that you decided to take on this coaching. And so many people were appreciative that you wanted me to interview them. Okay, and when I interviewed them, did they speak in venomous anger and rage? No. And that's why we read the feedback to them, because when we read it to them, we read it very slowly and calmly, etc. And so if somebody says, everybody hates me, I'll say, I beg to differ. You know, that's not what I heard. That was not my experience. And we can turn this around. Now, the question of, do you have to be a therapist to do this? You know, when I figured out this method on my own, and then I went back and got my doctorate to understand what the heck I was doing and why was it working anyway. I mean, that should have been the title of my dissertation. And that's where I built the conceptual framework for the method. And then nobody read my dissertation. So then I thought, well, I have to put together a course. I have to share this. I have to share this with other people. And when I first put together the course, I thought people, are you going to have prerequisites? Is this for psychologists only, or do you have to have a degree in psychiatry? And I didn't know the answer to that question. So I decided I wasn't going to set any, requirements, like you have to have this background or that background. What I have discovered in training so many people is that the people who have courage to deal with, people's distressed emotions, and compassion and emotional intelligence, which, we all score kind of high on that, or we wouldn't be coaches. We can all do this. And what I did was I distilled 2 trade secrets of therapy into the method. The one is that threat anxiety defense dynamic. Okay, that's a trade secret of, psychology. And I share it with my clients and they love it and it works. The other is the insight cycle, where we just go, why do you think they do that? And how can you reduce the perception of threats? So no, you don't need to be a therapist, but you have to be prepared. And I'm sure you've dealt with clients who've been very distressed. Would you agree with that?
Well, I don't think I have a long enough experience to, I've seen distress, but not to the level of distress that you were describing, of like, I want to kill myself, everybody hates me, what am I going to do? This level of shame that you were describing and guilt.
Yeah. Well, no, not everybody. Look, that wasn't my experience. People don't hate you. Many people said they were really impressed. And, I hear that you're really working hard to get things done. And I hear that you don't intend to cause this distress, and I'm here to help.
Okay.
I mean, that's what we do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Other questions? Any others? Doesn't anybody want to argue with me? What?
Laura,
What's the one?
Can I say something?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to share with the rest that I've been doing this and it's really been good. I mean, clients really appreciate this. So it does sound daunting when you first start off, but when you're in the game, everybody really loves you, So I've had that experience.
Yeah, when they see you, that we're co-researchers, and we're going to figure this out together. And I have a few handy-dandy concepts that I think will add clarity and focus. But yeah, they're so appreciative.
Yeah.
And they love it when they come in and they start, well, I was in this meeting and the head of the Western Division came in and everybody sat in that meeting and everybody clammed up and they wouldn't answer his questions. And I know why, because they're terrified of him. They love having that insight. They're now reading behavior and accurately analyzing it. So it's very rewarding. Yeah. Good. So any other questions?
Yes, this is Kai Chong here. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yes.
You can.
Yes, hi. Yes, so my question is this, because in terms of abrasive leaders, right? Let's say just recently this week, I had a case where we were doing some event and there was some, for example, some ushers on, there were some ushers on duty. So this person was saying that, in terms of the ushers, if you are not committed, we can change the ushers. So things like this is maybe the tone, but yet it sounds like a very harsh kind of way. So I'm thinking in this kind of scenario, right, where after that this person actually said that to the team or the people affected to say that I don't mean a hard a hard way, but this is to really make it succeed, things like that. So it seems that on one hand is like the tone is not really it's kind of abrasive, kind of a harsh tone. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking how do they approach this kind of situation where it's sort of it's more the tone perhaps.
Right. Okay. So what would happen is if you were using this method, you would interview coworkers. And let me tell you, after 8 interviews, maybe 8 to 10, you hear the same themes over and over again. You're not hearing anything new. So what would happen is a theme would come back that he makes threats. He will threaten the ushers that if they don't do what they're supposed to do, that he's going to get rid of them and find somebody else. So this would emerge in the feedback, the interviews. And what he would then see is that he's engaging in fight behavior and he's threatening people. And this is being very disruptive and stirring anxiety, and people don't want to work for him anymore, and everybody's, resentful or whatever. So in this method, he would get to see that it's a beautiful description, because when he talks with you, he says, I'm just trying to get the job done. I want things to go smoothly. So any threats to his competence as a boss who can get this done, he gets very anxious and he starts making threats, and it takes a toll. It's disrespectful and it's uncivil. So, using this method, the voices of the coworkers would tell him what he does and says. And one of the things he does is he makes threats. Now, if you don't have that and you're kind of mid-coaching with him, maybe you can share this threat, anxiety, and defense dynamic, and you could say, I understand you really want to get the job done, but have you ever been threatened? Have you ever had somebody say, do it or else? And I wonder if people are feeling anxious and resentful and going into flight mode, or going and complaining about you or whatever. How did you find out that did he tell you he was doing this, or did others?
Oh, no. I was just hearing. In fact, I was there.
You were there?
Yeah. So
Okay.
so that's what I heard. Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I prefer to have the voices of the coworkers bring forward the issues, but there may be times where you can say, look, can I offer a thought to you? I think you're doing yourself damage by handling people this way, and let me explain why. And if you're presenting it in a loving, caring way, many times they can hear it. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And Laura, that is exactly what my point is, that if we do approach somebody and they have no idea about how they're showing up, then you, like in this case, as you said, I could help you. That person say, brush you off. They say, okay, you want to talk about expertise, but I don't need your help. So that's a little bit challenging part.
But that's where the employer is key. The employer is key, because if the employer has met them and said, you've got to turn this around and this cannot go on, that's a threat. And their anxiety level is very high. And when they arrive on your doorstep, they're saying, I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to be demoted. I don't want to be plateaued. Help me. Help me find out why I'm perceived this way. I don't even believe I'm abrasive, but this is jeopardizing my career.
Right. So just what worked in the case that I am still working on was to create a positive spin and say that you've been here for so many years. Wouldn't you want to go to the next level? And if you're going to go on like this, it's not going to. So what can we do to create that for that next promotion for you? And that's how I got his ear in. And
that's right. You said, I want you to be a success.
Yeah.
And from what we're hearing, ain't going to happen. So I'm here to help you. Yeah. So you motivated him. But he had heard someone told him he wasn't going to get a raise, right? Or promoted.
Yes, he was wanting to be the intended or chosen one.
The chosen one.
That's how this I was able to catch this from his what he shared, and I was able to use it to motivate him. So I'm bringing this again, is that there has to be some kind of a motivation or a drive.
It comes from the employer,
from the individual as well.
Well, it starts with the employer, because if the individual's kind of clueless and the employer has just said, gee, we have these wonderful educational processes, and go see this miracle worker coach and talk about whatever you want, it's not going to work. But yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your engagement and participation. Unfortunately, we wish we could stay for a lot longer. I'm sure we've got a lot of questions, but we don't. So what I would suggest is that if you have further questions, do reach out. And thank you, Laura, so much for your generosity. So if you do have further questions, Laura have offered on a way that you could.
Yeah, just look up www.bosswhispering.com, or you can email me at crawshaw@bosswhispering.com, and any questions you have.
Thank you very much. So we'll send out the link to the recording so we can listen to it again, revisit the model. Personally, for me, I've got so much takeaway. I think we're a tad closer to helping our abrasive leaders really like the model, like the fact that we hold the space, hold the mirror back to the leader. So thank you very much, Laura, for your share.
Yes. Well, we set the tone of respect. We treat them very respectfully, and we model those behaviors, and we get them all calmed down, so. Good.
Wonderful.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk with all of you. I've really enjoyed it, and I appreciate all your really great questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
And thanks, Suman and
Thank you, Laura.
Bye, Suman. I'll see you in San Francisco, right?
Yeah. Laura, just wait for a minute.
Sure.
I just want to speak to you for a minute.
Okie dokie. All right.
So bye, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Bye.
Bye.
Wow.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. You're welcome.